We're going to talk a little bit more about those planning reforms. I'm joined now by the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight, Bob Seely. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News. I don't know if you picked up what Nick was saying. Pausing these reforms, good idea, bad idea?
I think it's a very good idea. We do need reform. So this is not just a question of no, 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 despite the sort of silly attacks by some so-called NIMBYs, i.e. local patriots. But we do need to get planning right. It is really important that it's on good principles. So being community-led, being levelling up-led, which is vital, and being green-led, environment-led. So what we're proposing, when we speak to Michael, as we're hopefully doing next week, we're going to be proposing that a small group of MPs work with ministers to make sure that we land these reforms right. This is certainly good news to the 100 or so members of the Planning Concern WhatsApp group, yeah.
What would it have meant if they hadn't been paused, if they'd gone ahead with these reforms? What would it have meant for the Isle of Wight?
Well, we don't know what the reforms are going to look like, but the simple problem is it's not what the reforms are, but it's how it's done and where the power lies. If we are just giving more power to developers, we're going to have a failed system. I'll give you an example on the island, since you're kind enough to ask. The Isle of Wight gives out quite a lot of permissions, unfortunately, very often for greenfield, low-density housing estates, which we shouldn't be doing. But we're doing that, and all developers then do is greedy landowners, frankly, and greedy developers bank those permissions, sit on them, sell them on, make a lot of money. No houses are ever built. But we then get complaints from the Ministry of Housing to say, we're not building. We give out permission. The permissions are land banked, and then nothing gets done. And then we have to give out more permissions as a result of a failed and flawed system. And we also need to do everything in our power, including a greenfield tax, including VAT on new builds maybe, to really reorientate to brownfield housing. And if most housing was going into brownfield sites, people wouldn't be complaining. It's the loss of the countryside, it's the loss of greenfields in suburban and city areas that is so painful. And that's universal, and that's felt by MPs, frankly, from across the divide, all throughout England and Wales.
Mr. Seely, do you know why that happens, what you've just described, that scenario, why that happens? Is it the developers? Is it the politicians not following up?
It's a flawed system, which has been, in the last 10 years, especially sadly, has been slightly tweaked too much in favour of developers and away from communities. We've done some great stuff. So the neighbourhood plans are a really good idea, because actually the evidence shows that where you have neighbourhood plans, local communities actually welcome a little bit more building. So by getting community ownership and community involvement, you actually can help the process. And so there's this false dichotomy that I think some people on the developer side are making, that somehow just freeing up more land and having more of a marketplace and enabling developers is going to result in more housing and better housing, and it won't. By giving power to communities and to local councils, and by forcing developers to go back into those brownfield areas, we can get the development we need, both in the suburbs, in the north for the levelling up, and down south, but we can get it where young people and people who've lived and been brought up in communities actually want to live. Because low density, greenfield, car dependent, it's bad for communities, it's dreadful for the environment, and frankly, it's dreadful for levelling up. And we've got an amazingly strong team in Michael's ministry. Michael Gove, big brain, Kemi Badenoch, excellent minister, Neil O'Brien, at the heart of this levelling up process. We want to make it work with them, and we want to make sure we get the right reforms, but ones that are not antagonistic to our community.
Right, I want to get on to the point of all of this being electorally toxic, but very quickly, are people happy to live on brownfield sites? Because there is this image, isn't there, that you're out in the countryside, you're surrounded by green.
Yes, but you're not surrounded by green if you're then living on a housing estate. And in fact, the people who had the green no longer have the green because your housing estate's been plonked probably in the middle of nowhere at the end of their garden. Yeah. So I think actually if you build high quality, beautiful housing in existing communities, in appropriate numbers, using land much more efficiently than we do, we can have our cake and eat it.
It's all about infrastructure.
we're wasting so much brownfield sites because developers just cherry pick the nice stuff and then sit on it. They don't even develop the land half the time.
Yeah, and it's the infrastructure that's needed, isn't it? Very
Okay,
quickly.
can I just come to that? That's
Yeah.
a really good point, because every time that we build another dual carriageway that's not wanted in Sussex, in Surrey, in Oxfordshire, in Northamptonshire, that money is not going to the levelling up that Neil and Kemi and Michael want to see up north. So this is, rather than this being a lose-lose battle, we can turn it into win-win. And we are the 95 MPs on the Planning Conservative Group are just desperately, really wanting to support government to make this work.
Mr. Seeley, very quickly, you have said that the results that we saw in Chesham and Amersham is just the start of a significant pushback from communities on planning. It could get worse, you're saying?
Yes, it will get worse. And that's why we all know it's going to get worse, which is why Michael has very sensibly paused this. And we need to work together, ministers and backbench members of Parliament, we need to work together to make sure we get this right. Because if we get this right, communities of all ages are going to be grateful for the work that we've done, putting in place a planning system which is community-led, which is levelling up-led, and which is environment-led. And that's what we need.